I'm Dave Jordan, president of the Kalamazoo Civil Roundtable. And tonight, my program is called Meanwhile South of the Border. It's about the French attempt to take over Mexico in 1862 and 1867. So I'm going to start with a brief background history of Mexico. 1521, Spain defeats the Aztecs and establishes the Kingdom of New Spain. By 1790, the Spanish Empire is at its height. And all this stuff in blue belongs to Spain, including the Philippines down here in the global thing, as well as, of course, Spain itself and everything. In 1808, Napoleon invades Spain. This starts a long 6-year war where Spain is busy fighting for its life. And the Spanish colonies take advantage of the Spanish military and financial weakness and declare independence. So in 1810, Mexico declares its independence. And after 11 years of war, they finally get their independence from Spain by the Treaty of Cordoba. And the first country to recognize Mexico is the United States. In 1823, Monroe Doctrine is issued. It declares that efforts by European powers to control or influence sovereign states in the New World would be viewed as a threat to U.S. security, which all sounds really good, but like the United States has like no Navy. I mean, this is the British pretty much enforce this because they don't want the Spanish back in South America or Latin America anyway. But it looks good. Sounds good PR for the U.S. And then for decades, a small political elite divided between the conservatives and the liberals fight for control of the government. The conservatives tend to support the old Spanish system of domination by the Roman Catholic Church, the military, and the landlords. The liberals want to move to a system of private industry and agriculture, more like what we have up in the United States. And there's widespread civil disorder as both these factions compete for control of the country. It often results in destruction or looting of private property. Most Mexicans have few options for claiming compensation as they have no representatives to speak on their behalf. Foreigners, including 6,000 French whose property was damaged or destroyed by rioters or bandits, were also usually unable to obtain compensation from the Mexican government, and they began to appeal for their own governments for help and compensation. So here's an example of the political turmoil in Mexico. This is our friend Santa Anna from the Mexican War and the Alamo. You may recognize him. He held the office of president 11 times, sometimes just for a few weeks, but, and there's people in between him. So this is an example of the kind of chaotic political environment that's going on in Mexico. And then, of course, there's the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848. U.S. defeated Mexican forces in every major battle. It ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and all that stuff in orange, the United States takes from Mexico. That little bit down at the bottom, where's that a pointer? Down there, that's the gas that gets bought later. But anyway, huge bunch of land, big problems for Mexico. So in the aftermath, two political parties emerged with different ideas about how to deal with this. This is kind of a carryover from the previous, isms. The conservatives argued that the U.S. Republican ideas were corrupt and that Catholic Mexico had to maintain the power of the church, reject radical democracy, and ally with European monarchies. The liberals contend that Mexico is not Republican enough, and the country needs to break the power of the Catholic Church, sweep away the old Spanish colonial institutions, and embrace change. So they have what they call the War of Reform. That's between 1857 and 1861. Juarez, down on the right there, is the leader of the liberal factions, and they win the war. And he becomes president of Mexico in March of 1861. He's a Zapotec Indian from Oaxaca. He institutes programs to reduce the power of the military and the Catholic Church, which is not popular, the military and the Catholic Church. And problem is that the Catholic Church owned a third of the land in Mexico. So this idea is they're going to confiscate all the property owned by the Catholic Church without paying them anything. Cemeteries are going to become national properties, and marriage is a civil contract. So those were particular onerous problems for the poor people because they had to pay all this money to the church just to get married and get married. And they had to pay the clergy these fees, to officiate in the ceremonies. And he was going to get rid of the legal obligation to pay tithes to the Catholic Church. Before it was the law, you had to pay your 10%, The whole Mexican economy is wrecked by this war. The liberals have been financed mostly by the United States, and the conservatives were financed mainly by the Europeans. The fleeing conservative government, led by Miramon, had emptied the treasury and stolen $660,000 from the British embassy. And so Juarez imposed on July 17th, 1861, after the beginning of the American Civil War, imposed a 2-year moratorium on the interest payments on the debt owed to foreigners. So how much money are we talking about here? Well, Mexico owed $69 million to Great Britain, $9 million to Spain, and only $2.86 million to France. And even though these debts were owed by the previous government, conservative government, that lost the war, the current government was liable to pay these debts under international law as it existed at that time. And the Europeans believe that the Juarez government can pay all this money off with the proceeds from selling this land that they've seized from the Catholic Church. So let's talk about France for a little bit here. France is led by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. That's who he was born and died. He's the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He led 2 unsuccessful coup attempts in 1836 and 1840. He gets elected president of France in 1848. He gets 74% of the vote. And around the time of his term, and then he seizes power and claims himself Emperor Napoleon III. Napoleon II was Napoleon's infant, 5-year-old son that Napoleon abdicated in favor of his son, but the Allies said, none of this, we're putting Louis XVIII back in charge. He's allied with Britain and Turkey against Russia in the Crimean War, fairly recently. Then he allied with the King of Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel, and helped drive the Austrians out. And Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy, again, to pacify the French Catholics, especially his wife, who has been described as like a Shiite Catholic. I mean, she is into it. She was raised by nuns and everything. Napoleon III guarantees that Rome will remain under the Pope and not be part of the Kingdom of Italy. And he gives the Pope a garrison, 8,000 French troops to garrison Vatican City. And then, as if that's not enough, he sends people over to start taking over Indochina. We all know how that ends. So on Halloween, 1861, France, Britain, and Spain signed the Convention of London. And the plan is to seize the custom house at Veracruz there on the coast and collect the customs duties, which are supposed to be about $7 or $8 million a year to pay off all these loans. The U.S. is also owed money by the Juarez faction, not the conservatives who lost the war. And they were invited to join the convention, but they declined. One of the agreement's articles is that none of the participating nations in this takeover of Veracruz can gain territorial, political, or financial advantage, nor can they attempt to get involved in the internal affairs, pull off a coup d'etat, or violate the rights of Mexican people during the course of this convention. Well, so the Europeans land troops in Veracruz. Spain's got a bunch of guys in Cuba, still in Cuba, and they're close. So they are going to bring 7,000 guys over. France is going to send 2,500. Britain's going to send over 700 Marines. Kind of reminds you of the joke that Bismarck said, what would you do if, somebody asked Bismarck, what would you do if the British Army invaded? And he said, I'd call the police. They have a very big army. So the Spanish fleet arrives at Veracruz with 6,000 guys from Cuba on December 8, 1861. They lay off in the water out there in the port for 6 days and they land. By this time, everybody that can is evacuated, took all their livestock, their horses, mules, cattle, wagons, everything. They deep feet for the interior. And this causes problems for the French logistically later on. So the British and French fleets arrive at Veracruz a little later, and they land troops to follow on January 8th. And the Allied commissioners meet in Veracruz on the next day and discover they got conflicting instructions. What a surprise. Spanish General Prim is named chairman of the Allied Commission because, and that's him, it's because Spain's got the most guys here. And meanwhile, then, in the middle of January, French Minister of Mexico, Pierre-Alphonse Dubois Dessalines, demands an additional $12 million for debts owed to and injuries suffered by the French citizens, and another $15 million to pay off bonds owned by a Swiss banker named Becker. So the British and the Spanish smell a rat, and they prepare to leave Mexico, which they do shortly afterwards. So Mexican Congress grants Juarez emergency powers. And on January 25th, 1862, he authorizes the death penalty for anyone invading Mexico and for any Mexicans that aid them. And this was especially controversial because Mexico had abolished the death penalty. They did not have that, for murder, anything. They did not have a death penalty. But as part of his emergency powers, he institutes this. So the French start sending in more guys. They send 2,000 guys in on March 16th. Charles Luttrell, the Count of Lawrence Wednesday. And accompanying the French is Mexican General Juan Almonte. He had been aide-de-camp to Santa Anna at the Alamo in 1836, and allegedly is the guy responsible for saving Susanna Dickinson, one of the women at the Alamo, from getting killed. Served in a variety of positions with conservative governments, and he's you might want to think of him as, people may think of him as a turncoat, because he's on the French side, but he's under the impression that unless we can persuade some European power to aid us in establishing some stable government, it's inevitable the whole of Mexico must be swallowed up by the United States. So he would rather be swallowed up by Catholic France than Protestant United States. So the imperialists, which are basically the French and the conservative Mexicans, they begin to march on Mexico City. On April 27th, Lorenzo and about 6,300 French troops begin to advance toward Mexico City. They got a supply train that's 260 wagons long. It's got more than 200,000 bottles of wine. Now, I'm not sure if this was like standard procedure for the French, just the way they were, or they're worried about Montezuma's revenge and they want to mix the wine with the water and not get dysentery. But anyway, they got this huge baggage. And they're supposed to rendezvous with 2,500 Mexican allies under General Leonardo Marquez near the town of Puebla, Marquezo. So in many ways, this whole French intervention is a continuation of the Reform War. Conservatives are on the side of the French, and the liberals are on the side of the Mexican patriots, I guess we'll call them. Yes. They're gone by now. They've left. They're out of the picture. Thank you, Tom. So the Juaristas cavalry, they defeat Marquez at the Battle of Atlico on March 4th, 1862. That's General O'Haran, who's commanding the Mexicans, the Juarista Mexicans. And so the French are on their own going towards Puebla, which is occupied by about 4,000 Juaristas under this guy, General Ignacio Zaragoza. The town of Puebla itself is very pro-French. The bishop there proclaimed that the French were, quote, allies of the church, unquote, and ordered priests to not provide sacraments to the Mexican Republican Army. And there's a lot of different little terminology here. Republicans, Juaristas, there's all these different names for these guys, and there's the imperialist and the French on the other side. Depends on whose sources you're looking at as who they call it. But anyway, the priest in Puebla pray for, quote, rescue, unquote, by the French during church services. And Lawrence hears all this, the French general, and he expects that my soldiers are going to be covered with flowers as they advance to Puebla. Well, so you get to Puebla. How to attack it? French army is coming from the north. Marquez is not going to be coming from the southwest to help. There's Puebla down there in the gray, and you can see it in the upper right hand. There's a couple of forts here: Fort Guadalupe and Fort Loreto, and there's a trench in between. Mexican General Monte, who's with the French, has both captured and defended Puebla in all these many conflicts up until now. And he says Puebla has never been captured from the north. Everybody comes around to the flat ground of the side of the town and fights and attacks the town that way. But Lawrence has got this huge supply train. And so he says, if I come around and attack the town, people are coming running down off this hill. They're going to destroy my wagon train. We're going to be out of luck here in the middle of Mexico. So, and by the way, there's only two battles I'm going to talk about in this whole thing. This is one. And so the French decide to attack Puebla on May the 5th, 1862, or Cinco de Mayo, as you may have heard, that's where this Mexican holiday comes from. So Zaragoza is surprised the French are massing to attack from the north, and he swiftly brings all his guys up out of the town and puts them on top of that hill there. The hill is too steep for the French artillery to be effective. And when the French do attack, they're expected to be welcomed with flowers and stuff. So their attacks are disjointed and piecemeal. And then in the middle of it, they get this thunderstorm that happens, and it turns the hillside into a slippery morass that horses can't go up it. Zaragoza has put these Zacapoaxtla warriors armed with machetes inside this fort right here. They don't have any muskets, but they got their machetes. And as the French soldiers get their ladders and climb up over the walls, these guys whack their heads off with machetes, and the heads and bodies fall down and freaks the French out who are attacking us, as you might imagine. So this is a picture of what's going on here. You can see there's one of the forts there. You can see these guys in the trying to go this detail. And it just turns into a fiasco. So now what? The French are low on supplies, especially ammunition. And they wait a few days for the Mexicans to climb down off this hill and counterattack. But Zaragoza's no idiot. He knows if he comes down off this hill, the French cavalry can get to him, the French artillery can blow his guys to bits. So they just sit there and wait the French out. And the French just eventually, after a few days, they withdraw to the town of Orizaba back towards the coast. Zaragoza is disgusted by the support and trouble of the French, and he's quoted as saying in his report, how good it would be to burn Puebla. The city is mourning the events of the 5th. It's sad to say so. It is a regrettable truth. So the Mexicans do send some guys down under Ortega, General Ortega, and they get driven away on June 13th. He's the president of the Supreme Court, which is, in their system, is the next in line to Juarez. They don't have a vice president. The president of the Supreme Court is the guy that takes over if Juarez is incapacitated or dies or whatever. Zaragoza, the good general, dies of typhoid fever back in Puebla on September 8th. So Ortega takes over the defense of Puebla. So the French response to defeat at Puebla takes a while because there are no direct communications between Mexico and France. There's no underground, transatlantic cable or anything like that. You have to send somebody up to like New York or Philadelphia or whatever and send a message to, across the ocean, and then they got to respond back, and then you got to come back down to Mexico. It takes a while to do all this. So finally, it takes them from April in September to get some more reinforcements. General Foray and 8,000 reinforcements arrived in Mexico on September 21st, 1862. Now, in the meantime here, the French have kind of missed their best chance for this because up until this point, summer of 1862, the Confederates they're in Maryland, they're in Antietam, they're in Kentucky at Perryville. They are on a roll, and the U.S. is way too busy to pay attention to any of this. And Confederates, they win the war, who knows? But Foray, he had served well in Italy and the Crimea, but his main qualification, he had helped Napoleon III in his rise to power. And he replaces Lorenzé as commander of the French in Mexico. And then in October, they send General Bazaine and 12,000 men. He is probably my favorite French guy in this. He is a soldier's soldier. He rose from the ranks. He flunked out of the French military academy, enlisted in the Foreign Legion as a soldier, rose up to become a Marshal of France. The French soldiers just love him. And he doesn't like the Mexican conservatives, which is kind of a problem because those are his allies. In November of 1862, Lincoln prohibits all arms exports for the remainder of the U.S. Civil War. He's worried that any munitions shipped to Mexico or anywhere else will end up in the hands of the Confederates, which this later causes embarrassment to Seward, Secretary of State Seward, and Mexican officials in the U.S., through the French buying horses and mules to ship them to Mexico to haul their supply wagons because they can't get to Mexico. Seward's got to say, well, those aren't weapons of war. It's embarrassing. So the French say, okay, we're going to go to Puebla again. Now they got 28,000 guys. And they go up, and they don't go up the hill again. They go around the hill, and they just circle the city, and they start besieging it. And they hold out for a couple of months, and then they surrender. And the French are welcomed as liberators by the people in Puebla. You would not know this from the statues and monuments in Puebla today, by the way. All Ignacio and Ortega, they're all the guys, So now what? What are you going to do all these prisoners? Well, the Mexican imperialist officers say that all the 1,508 captured Juarist officers should be shot. Forney's not doing that. This is not the way we play in France. So in the captured officers, they refuse to sign paroles. And so they're ordered to be marched back to Veracruz and sent to France. But they're not really too tightly guarded because 558 of them escape, including Ortega and 3 other generals. They kind of wander off and nobody catches them. 5,000 of the Juarista enlisted men switch sides and they join the Mexican imperialist army. Hey, a paycheck's a paycheck. They don't really have any skin in this game. When you're not the lead dog in the sled, it doesn't really matter. 4,000 of them are sent to work on extending the railroad from Veracruz. There's no railroad, it's only part way there. And then 2,000 of them are sent to work cleaning up and repairing all the damage in Puebla. So the French advance guard, that's pretty much it for the Mexican army. The French guard, advance guard enters Mexico City on June the 7th. Again, this is right after Chancellorsville, pre-Gettysburg. There's South is looking semi-good. That's Bazaine on the left, I think, and Forney on the right. Bazaine had been commanding the advance guard, and you can see all these Mexican people welcoming, throwing petals down, and all that. That may be propaganda. I don't know. I don't think Mexico City was nearly as pro-French as Puebla was. So they put Bazaine in charge of all the French forces in Mexico on July the 16th. And now what do? We captured Mexico City. Most of the times in a European war, the war is over, capital city is captured, other side gives up. But they don't. So the French and imperialist troops began trying to pacify the country by occupying the cities and the larger towns. This looks eerily familiar to like Vietnam or Spain and the Napoleonic wars, this is kind of what happens. Convinced that the French are going to win, many of the Juaristas just go home or again switch sides, just like the prisoners at Puebla. The remaining Juaristas turned to guerrilla warfare, which guerrilla or guerrilla, actually in Spanish, that kind of started in Spain against Napoleon. It worked really well for them, and it's very hard to put down. They have a lot of mounted troops. They can quickly assemble and strike French supply columns, small garrisons, messengers, and then quickly disperse. Some of them are actually really, sure enough, soldiers. Some of them are just bandits who are taking advantage of the fact that, hey, we can rob and kill people, and that's a patriotic thing, and nobody will get mad at us. So there's a lot going on with that. So Juarez, he evacuates Mexico City, and this is where all and you can see this kind of shows who's who. This is a map on the right where the conservative is dominant in British purple, basically Baja. But again, like anything, any Civil War types of Revolutionary War, there's third of the people probably care. One for the conservatives, third of the people probably want the liberals, and third of people just leave us all alone. So the only other battle I'm going to talk about is the Battle of Cameron, which is April 30th, 1860. And there's a French Foreign Legion officer, Captain Jean Desjeux. And he's stationed in this town, and there's a French supply column coming up the road. And they see these guys off in the distance, messengers asking help to guard this train. So he leads 2 lieutenants and 62 men of the Foreign Legion, none of whom he's ever seen before today, to join this convoy that's got us money and supplies for the siege at Puebla, which is actually what Puebla even calls. The Juaristas spot them and eventually end up with getting 3,300 men keep coming in dribs and drabs. Danjou withdraws into Hacienda Cameron in order to draw the Juaristas away from the convoy. So the Mexicans come up and they demand him to surrender, and he refuses the Mexican demands to surrender. And he asks the man to swear on his wooden hand not to surrender. He's got this wooden hand. I'll show you that later. It's articulated fingers. It's really pretty cool. Anyway, so he's sworn all these guys they're not going to surrender. So he gets killed early in the day. Fighting lasts for 10 hours. French are asked to surrender 3 times. And Juarista losses for all estimates all over the map. 300 is probably a good guess. Real number was. Finally, they're out of ammunition, food, and water. And the last 5 unwounded legionnaires fix bayonets and charge out of the building. Like Caspian and Sunday. Some of the men fall outright, and the rest surrender. They finally agree to surrender, allowed to keep their weapons and equipment. Juaristas promised to take care of their wounded lieutenants. So, when the survivors are brought to General Milan, he said, "Is this all of them? Is this all of the men who are left?" Then in amazement, he explained, "These are not men, these are demons." So, and this is a picture of the Hacienda Cameron. There's Mexicans on the roof, there's Mexicans there all over. But this is a big deal for the French Foreign Legion, which we'll talk about later on. So, okay, so the French have captured Mexico City. They decide to form a temporary government, junta, and they nominate 35 Mexican citizens to constitute a Junta Superior de Gobierno. And they're tasked with electing a triumvirate that's going to serve as the executive branch of this new government. And the three people that are chosen are Juan Almonte, this French general, Archbishop Bastida, who we'll talk about a lot, and Jose Mariano Salas, who's an old retired general. And the junta is supposed to choose 216 Mexican citizens who, together with the junta superior, were to constitute an assembly of notables that was to decide what the government's going to be. So Jose Mariano Salas is described as a mummy under the dominant member of this time, Bishop Albastida. He had previously been Bishop of Puebla, but they took off and went to Rome when Juarez. And on March 18th, the Pope named him Archbishop of all Mexico. And the only thing that he is interested in is getting the church's money, property, and power back. So, well, that's not good. It's lost in the conversion here. So the Assembly of Notables resolved that Mexico is going to be a monarchy, and they send a delegation over to Maximilian to offer him the crown of Mexico. I apologize for why that thing's. You know what was on that picture? What was missing from that? Anyway, so Maximilian is hesitant to accept. These are the Mexican guys. These are mostly exiles. They're conservatives that have left the country because of all the turmoil, because they lost the Reform War. So, you know, Maximilian's a little hesitant to accept this offer. He wants a written agreement of support from Britain so that he won't just be a French puppet. The British think the U.S. is going to eventually win the Civil War by now. It's post-Gettysburg, you know, everything else. And then, you know, the United States is not going to tolerate a foreign power in Mexico. Meanwhile, you know, the United States actually built a navy, you know, Provost blockade and everything else. So it's kind of somebody they probably don't really want to mess with for Mexico. So who is this Maximilian guy? Well, he was born in 1832. He's the younger brother of the Austrian Emperor Francis. He's very popular. He's very charming, a lover of art and nature. He especially loves botany and butterflies. Excuse me. But he's a dreamer and a dilettante. He fiddles with a lot of stuff and thinks great thoughts, but you know, he's not a practitioner at all. For something to do, his brother puts him in charge of the Austrian Navy for 7 years. They did have a navy. They owned Venice at the time, and they also owned what's now Croatia. And he emphasized shipbuilding, but didn't really pay too much attention to training or seagoing experience. He don't like to build ships. That was fun. But he did initiate a large-scale scientific expedition in 1857, 1859, during which the frigate SMS Novara became the first Austrian warship to circumnavigate the globe. And he's married to Charlotte, or Carlotta in Spanish. She's the only daughter of the King of Belgium, Leopold I. He marries her on July 27, 1857. She was born in 1840. Her mother died when she was 10. This is one of my favorite descriptions. He was described as beautiful but not attractive. How many of us have known women that you could describe that way? Anyway, she was apparently very pretty, but a bit of a bee. You know, just a little not a a little high strung too. Well, I know. She's got a tendency to judge those around her harshly. She's real ambitious, strong-willed, and she's also extremely religious, like Napoleon III's wife. So Maximilian served in Milan as the viceroy of the Austrian possessions in Italy, which are Lombardy and Venetia for a couple of years. He's very popular with the Italians. So popular, he's asked to resign on April 10th, 1859 by because he's too liberal and being financially irresponsible. You know? So he retires to his estate Miramar in Trieste. And then he goes in December 1860, he goes on a 3-month trip to Brazil, and he just loves looking around the flora birds and fauna. This is really in his wheelhouse. It's tough for him. He's the kid brother of the emperor. It's just, think Prince William, Prince Harry. He's got like no real job, no real future. So they tend to get in trouble, if they don't find something to occupy themselves with. So why do the French, through their proxies in Mexico, why choose Maximilian to be the emperor of Mexico? Well, Europe's not going to sit by and stand for Bonaparte. Remember the Bonaparte family ruling Mexico. And they hope this will improve Franco-Austrian relations. The French just beat Austria in a war. It'd be nice to, make peace with them and get the royal families kind of together and stuff. Napoleon III's pretty sure he can rule Mexico through Maximilian because Maximilian's kind of a dilettante, a doofus, and wants to do butterflies. Maximilian is actually highly thought of by the foreign community. His rule in Italy was considered liberal and enlightened. He had previously been offered to be king of Greece. And Britain even suggested Emperor Franz Joseph put Maximilian in charge of Hungary, which did not make Emperor Franz Joseph happy. You want my kid brother to be, you think he could do a better job than me anyway. So he's very happy to have his more popular younger brother on the other side of the world, away from him. And the French Empress Eugenie wants a Catholic. I don't know French, so if I mess those up, cut me some slack. She wants a Catholic monarch in Mexico to offset what she sees as the heretics of the United States. Maximilian is also a Habsburg. Habsburgs had ruled Spain and Mexico and all that stuff between 1516 and 1700. So there's kind of a family connection there, Habsburg line. Why Maximilian? Another interesting thing is he is rumored to be the illegitimate grandson of Napoleon Bonaparte. So this is Maximilian in the center. This is Napoleon II. And that's Maximilian's alleged father, Archduke Franz Karl. Now, Napoleon II was really good friends with Max's mom. They hung out together, and it may have been strictly platonic. There's a lot of rumors going around about that. But look at the pictures, and see, who you think who's more likely to be the guy's dad here. And this sort of thing would just, that's called Napoleon III. So I'd get my illegitimate cousin to be the king of Mexico. This is super. So, well, why not? Well, as we discussed, politically, he's very liberal. He actually approves of most of the reforms that Juarez has implemented. He was that way in Italy. He's not really the guy that the conservatives probably want running their country. He's got absolutely no understanding of or interest in financial matters. Like I say, he got in trouble in Italy for not paying attention to the budgets and everything else. His only experience is with the Navy. He doesn't know anything about Army stuff. He's never been to Mexico. He doesn't speak a word of Spanish. He or his wife, neither one of them speaks a lick. And he is not particularly ambitious, unlike his wife, Charlotte. She was, Princess of Belgium. She wants to be something other than hang around Miramar and chase butterflies. So, so Archbishop Labastida attempts an insurrection. This is before Maximilian gets there. He's frustrated by Bazin's refusal to work towards returning church property. One of the problems for Labastida is that a lot of people that bought the church property are French citizens who live in Mexico. Bazin leaves Mexico City to supervise some troop movements in the Mexican interior. So on November 18th, Labastida calls for excommunication of any government official who refuses to restore church property and closes the cathedral in Mexico City for the spectacular mass they have every Sunday for the Bazin gets word of this. He sends word back to the guy left in charge, and he orders that guy, says, reopen that cathedral by simply blasting open the doors with artillery if you have to. And so mass is held as planned. Again, the French soldiers just love this guy. He is one of them. So meanwhile, Maximilian's still kind of thinking about whether they're going to do this or not. As I mentioned, there's no direct communications between Austria and Mexico. And somebody figures out that if Franz Joseph dies, Maximilian might become the emperor of Austria. And he's going to be thousands of miles away with no way to contact him and stuff. And so Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph announces that Maximilian does take this job as Emperor of Mexico. He's got to forfeit for himself and his heirs any rights, both the Austrian throne as an Archduke of Austria. But they're still going to give him his allowance that he gets, which is in florins, which is like the Austrian money in francs annually. And they're going to give him some Austrian volunteers to help out, help him out in his new kingdom. Meanwhile, Congress in the U.S., the U.S. House unanimously approves a resolution by Henry Winter Davis, Republican from Maryland, declaring that the U.S. would refuse, quote, to acknowledge any monarchical government erected on the ruins of any Republican government under the auspices of any European power. Interestingly enough, the Senate declines to approve the resolution, describing it as, quote, the first attempt in our history to establish the doctrine that Congress has a paramount authority in foreign affairs. So it doesn't really, it's not a law, but it's a bad omen for Maximilian that this is, they're not going to sit still for this. I don't know. There is a resemblance. I will grant you that. So Maximilian thinks it's over, and with Carlotta's urging, this is his castle Miramar, beautiful place, still there in Trieste. So they signed this Treaty of Miramar on April 10th, 1864. It's between the French and Maximilian and the Mexicans. And Maximilian, again, having no idea about finances, he agrees that the cost of the French expedition in Mexico, which has been already $270 million, or will be by million francs, sorry, by July 1st, 1864, they're going to get reimbursed by the Mexican government. And the amount that they haven't paid back is going to bear interest at 3% a year. And then beginning in July 1st, Mexico is going to pay France 1,000 francs per year for every French soldier in Mexico. And Mexico is going to pay the French subjects for all the debts that are incurred during the intervention. So I don't know where Maximilian thinks he's going to get all this money, but he agrees to this. And so the French also say, okay, there's 38,000 French guys in Mexico. We're going to cut this back to 28,000 in 1865, 25,000 in 1866, and 20,000 by 1867. We're going to leave 8,000 members of French Foreign Legion for 6 more years after that. But the Mexicans are going to pay for that. This is like building the wall and getting the Mexicans to pay for it, whatever. Mexico is going to pay 400,000 francs every 2 months for the supplies, the food and beverages and wine, apparently, for the French forces. So lots of money here for that Maximilian's on the hook for. But they set sail for Mexico on April 14th, 1864. Maximilian is seen crying as their ship leaves the harbor. They stop in Rome for a brief visit to get a blessing from Pope Pius IX. And the whole subject of recovery of church property confiscated by the Mexican government, they don't even come up. You would think that would be something they would discuss, but no, they don't talk about that. But Pope does stress that Maximilian will have to respect the rights of the church. And the church property, as I mentioned, church property owners are a problem because most of the new owners of the property are French. And that's who your army is kind of supporting. So they take this trip to Mexico, and it's a long crossing. And they don't talk any, Carlotta, or Charlotte, yes, she's not in Mexico yet, so we'll call her Charlotte. They rarely discuss the serious diplomatic, political, economic, everything else difficulties they might have. Instead, they spend all their time preparing the etiquette of their future court in great detail. I mean, who's going to sit next to who at dinner, and what the chamberlain's duties are, and what, all this crap. It's 600 pages by the time they get through with it. All these ceremonial functions and protocols. And the Austrian court had probably the most onerous, minute ways to get in trouble, for court etiquette stuff of anybody. But that's what they're doing. They're not, you know. So they get to Veracruz on May 28th, 1864. This is a great painting of them landing there. You see standing up at the boat. They're both standing up at the prow of the boat. Totally fanciful picture because they're 3 days ahead of schedule. Nobody knows they're coming. Nobody's there. Nobody's there to meet. And now it's Carlotta's turn to cry. She's sobbing as they pass through this city, and nobody's paying. So they do have some help from the folks back home. As you know, Carlotta, she's the daughter of the King of Belgium. So the Belgians send 1,500 guys to help out with this thing. Bazin says, okay, you can come, but you're going to serve under French commanders, which does not make the Belgians happy because they're only recently independent from France. They should feel like they should be under their own command. Franz Joseph sends 6,800 Habsburg troops, which are Austrians, Italians, Croatians, Poles, and everything to Mexico. They're brigaded with some Mexican conservative units, and they form a division commanded by Austrian General Thun. So it's not just the French. There's, you know, you got the Mexicans and all these other foreign troops there. So in December, the Pope sends this guy, Francesco Meglia. He arrives from Rome with a message from the Pope. Hey, why haven't you got the church lands back? You know, what's all this freedom of religion crap you got going on here? You know, this is supposed to be a Catholic country. You know, restore the monasteries and the convents. And he threatens to withdraw the support of the church from Maximilian. Carlotta replies, if the church will not help us, we will serve her against your will. She tells Bazin they should throw the nuncio out the window. Amazingly enough, Bazin does not do that. I'm sure he wanted to, but he didn't. Maximilian is a little calmer. He writes back and he says that the pious Catholicism in Mexico that he had been told about before leaving Europe was a myth. Mexican clergy did not understand their own religion. He had visited regions where the people had never seen their bishop. Even the adults were not baptized, let alone the children. Knowledge of the holy sacraments was altogether absent. You know, he's like, you know, don't know what you guys have been doing here, but it hasn't been like what you're supposed to be. So meanwhile, Lee surrenders to Grant. And soon after the surrender, Grant says to a young staff officer, now for Mexico. Secretary of State Seward believes that France is going to withdraw from Mexico and a war is not going to be necessary. And good for him, because remember, early in the war, he was the guy telling Lincoln, we should get in a foreign war, and then all these Confederates will come home to the roost, and they'll all be, and Lincoln's like, one war at a time, Mr. Seward. Well, he's learned from this, and he says, no, let's not do this. And he's concerned that any American troops intervening in Mexico not going to be any more favorably looked upon by the Mexicans than the French troops, you know, because after all, we just stole a bunch of land from them like 20 years before this or something. So, you know, cooler heads prevail to some extent. Grant does send Sheridan to Texas with 50,000 guys to pacify Texas and parts of Louisiana. Everybody's concerned that ex-Confederates would join the Maximilian's forces and the Civil War will continue. So Sheridan doesn't cross the Rio Grande, but he establishes supply dumps north of the river and leaves them unguarded. And the Juaristas come over at night and they take everything. They take weapons, ammunition, food. They're indirectly supporting Mexico. So meanwhile, Bazin, his wife had died while he was in fleet. He's 54 years old. He marries Josefa de la Peña de Escarate. She's a 17-year-old niece of the former president of Mexico. She goes by the nickname of Pepita. The bride's family are Juaristas, and a rumor starts that Bazin, he's going to kind of nudge Maximilian out of the way, and he's going to be the emperor of Mexico. So Maximilian's got a lot of problems. His biggest problem is he's got no control or authority over the French military. they get their orders and their instructions from France. And they often have a whole lot different agendas than Maximilian Empire. And they're polite and respectful to him personally. They like him. He's a nice guy, but they have zero confidence in his military abilities, and they don't really value his suggestions. And the French generally have a poor opinion of Mexicans, and they don't do anything really to organize an army of native. Uh, they don't really supply them or anything. They're kind of on their own hook. The ones that the imperial forces, under Maximilian. So, and he's not really embraced or supported by the Catholic Church because he won't give them their land back and all their privileges. And there's no functioning Mexican bureaucracy. So he can issue these decrees, but there's nobody there to carry them out. So he is in a world of hurt, really. You feel sorry for the guy. In July, 4th of July, Joe Shelby in 1864, about 1,000 Confederates crossed the Rio Grande. He's offered commander of the Juarista forces in 3 states if he will join them. So he puts it to a vote. His men say, they're mostly like Texans and they hate Mexicans. They mostly vote, we're going to go join Maximilian. And on the way, they rescue a French garrison of Matahuela. And they meet with Maximilian on September 3rd, and they offer to raise an army of Civil War veterans to support him. But Maximilian turns down the offer. He says he thinks he can govern Mexico without foreign troops. Not sure why, but he thinks he does. So Shelby's troops disband. Some stay in Mexico and start farms or businesses. Some go north and join the Juaristas. The rest of them just go home. So Maximilian believes that Juarez, his term of office has expired, has fled to the United States, ending the war. Actually, he's in El Paso del Norte, as I put on the map there, present-day Juarez. Juarez is not really supposed to be president anymore. That guy who was the head of the Supreme Court is supposed to be the president, but Juarez, they can't run an election right now. Juarez just stays in power. October 3rd, Maximilian issues this decree, which probably was written by Bazoon, that commended Juarez's followers for their valor and constancy, but declared that further resistance would endanger the people and be punished with summary execution. And they start carrying out this policy, and numbers vary, but best estimate is about 11,000 people get executed. This does nothing to win the hearts and minds of the people, inflames the resistance. From the French point of view, they think Juarez has left the country. The war's got to be over now, man. We got your capital, we got cities, but nope. War is still going on. Well, what's going on back in Europe? The cost in men and money of this adventure in Mexico is becoming real unpopular in France, and they're under increasing diplomatic pressure from the U.S. to withdraw their forces. Napoleon III, yeah, he's the emperor, but by no means is he an absolute monarch. He's got a legislature he's got to deal with and everything, and so on April 11th, he orders all French troops in the interior to withdraw to Mexico. And then on June 28th, Maximilian gets this letter from Napoleon stating that he will have to withdraw the French troops. So Maximilian considers abdicating. Game is up. But Carlotta insists on going to France personally, try to get Napoleon to change his mind. So she goes back to Europe to get support. She leaves Veracruz on July 13th. She gets in France less than a month later. She insists on meeting Emperor Napoleon III. He's bedridden with illness, not sure how sick he really was, but he really didn't want to see her. But she manages to get in there somehow, and she reminds him of his promises of support, and he refuses to negotiate new financial and military guarantees. The French Council of Ministers confirmed Napoleon III's position. Like, yeah, we're not sending you any more guys. We're not spending any more money. We're done. And they formally oppose maintaining any military presence in France, by France in Mexico. So meanwhile, what else is going on? Well, Prussian Minister Otto von Bismarck started the Austro-Prussian War, also called the 7 Weeks' War, because that's how long it took the Prussians to crush the Austrians. The Austrian army was routed at the Battle of Königgrätz or Sadowa on July 3rd, and Prussia becomes a dominant power in Europe. Now, Napoleon III expected it was going to be a long war. He was going to sit this out until one of those guys made him a good offer, and then he was going to join the side that gave him the best offer. Well, that didn't work, and now, holy crap, Prussia is a big boy, and he's worried they're going to come after France next. Spoiler alert, they do. So Carlotta begins to lose her sanity. She becomes convinced that Napoleon has spies in her entourage and he plans to poison her. The Belgians and the Austrians, meanwhile, say, well, if the French are out, we're done. We're out too. We're not sticking around. So she goes back to the palace in Miramar, and then Maximilian, she gets word from him saying, well, go see the Pope. He kind of in the, so she goes to the Pope. He refuses to help Napoleon III change his mind. So then she's convinced that people are going to want to kill her. She'll only drink out of the Trevi fountain with her own goblet she brings. He goes back to the Vatican a few days later. She refuses to leave for fear of assassination. She'll only eat food from the Pope's plate. She spends the night on a cot in the library. Major scandal. Woman sleeping in the Pope's library, in the Vatican. Holy crap, So, Carlotta's brother comes down from Belgium and convinces her, let's go home. She goes back to Miramar. She gets seen by psychiatrists, psychologists, whatever. Freud's around by now, and so she's diagnosed with, quote, madness with fixed ideas of persecution. And Maximilian finds out about this kind of by accident in a letter to somebody else that he happens to see on October 18th, 1866. So poor Maximilian. The French are withdrawing their support. Austrians are withdrawing their support. Your wife's gone crazy back in Austria. You no longer can be Emperor of Austria. What the heck? So February 5th, 1867, the French army evacuates Mexico City. But then begs Maximilian to abdicate and come with them. Maximilian allows himself to be convinced by some of his lackeys that the Mexicans don't object to him personally. Oh no, they just want the French out. And he feels like there's nothing for him back in Austria. So February 13th, he leaves most of the remaining foreign troops in Mexico City, which is basically the Belgians. And he leaves about 7,000 guys northwest to Querétaro. General Miramon suggests operating out of Querétaro and striking Juaristas nearby individually before they can unite, which is actually a pretty smart thing to do. They could have gone and beaten these guys individually, used with Querétaro as their center of operations, and gone out and defeated these different Juarista groups individually before they linked up. But he listens to other advisors and decides he's going to stay in Querétaro and wait for all the loyal imperialist Mexicans to come join him. Well, that doesn't really happen, and it's a bad military position. The city is surrounded by higher ground, which Maximilian's forces do not occupy. The Mexicans are like looking down on them. Dien Bien Phu, the famous French loss. Anyway, so they surround Querétaro and they start siege operations. March the 12th, French have left Mexico. Bazin's the last guy on the boat. And on May 15th, the Juarista forces enter the town and they capture Maximilian. They have a trial, and Maximilian on the right there, open up his jacket, so his white shirt. Aim here, guys. And General Miramon in the center and Mejia on the left. They're all shot by firing squads in Querétaro after a quick trial. Mexican imperialists find out about this the next day and they surrender Mexico City. What's the point? Emperor's dead. I keep this going. Same day, Seward receives a notice from Franz Joseph that he's ready to establish Maximilian and all his rights of succession as Archduke of Austria after his renunciation of all his projects in Mexico. A day late, dollar short. Okay. So what's the aftermath of all this? Well, major European powers break diplomatic relations with Mexico. They're mostly monarchies. They don't like the idea of getting royal families shot. Prussia is the first one to resume relations, and they come back in a couple of years. Italy's next. Oddly enough, Britain and France don't restore relations until the 1880s. France I can kind of get, but Britain, I don't know what they were thinking. Austria does not restore relations with Mexico until 1901. Franz Joseph is still emperor, and he's still pissed they shot his brother. So, but no other countries ever tried to take over Mexico since 1867. So there's that. Juarez, when the French leave, Mexican politics goes back in its usual state of chaos. Santa Anna tries to come back, take power again, but he gets captured. Juarez wants him executed, but he gets exiled for 8 more years. They have an election. There's a 3-way election for president in 1871. Nobody gets a majority, so it goes like into the House of Representatives, and Juarez gets chosen as president, but he dies the next year. And years later, Mr. Mussolini will name his baby boy Benito Juarez. Napoleon III, well, somehow Bismarck convinced France to declare war on Prussia. Napoleon III joins his army, and they get trapped in the Sedan, and they surrender on September 2nd. Eugenie tries to carry on the war, but a republic is declared, so she goes to England. Napoleon joins her in exile on March 20th, 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War is over, but he dies a couple years later. So then, he was commander-in-chief of the Army of the Rhine in the Franco-Prussian War. When Napoleon III is captured and the Republic is declared, he refuses to recognize the Third Republic. And unfortunately for him, he's trapped in the city of Metz and under siege. He surrenders his army to Prussia. Got to blame somebody. Napoleon III's in England, can't get to him. So, okay, he gets convicted of treason and sent to Port Royal on the Ile Sainte Marguerite. But again, the army loves him, so he's treated more like an exile than a prisoner. He makes a rope from parcel rope and baggage straps. And during the night of 10th of August, 1874, he attaches one end to his body, ties the other end to a gargoyle on that wall of that castle there, climbs down the 300-foot cliffs to a boat, which his wife, bless her heart, Pepita, has brought over from Cannes with her brother. He eventually moves to Madrid and lives in relative poverty. In 1886, Pepita goes back to Mexico to try to get back some of the family fortune, but she's unsuccessful. She lives in obscurity at her aunt's old house till she dies in 1900. Bazin survives an assassination attempt in 1887. Not sure why they wanted to kill him, but anyway, has a stroke the next year, gets buried in Madrid. But in 1895, he's rehabilitated and brought back to Paris and buried there. Franz Joseph, his son, he has a tragic life too. His son, Crown Prince Rudolph, commits suicide in 1889. His wife, the Empress Elizabeth Sisi, she's assassinated in 1898. His nephew and heir presumptive, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, well, we know how that ended. He gets assassinated in 1914. He lives till 1916, almost, till the end of World War I. Carlotta, she never regains her sanity. They finally tell her in 1868 that Maximilian's dead. And she lives in various palaces in Belgium with relatives until 1879, when she moves to Bouchot Castle, which is there with all the ducks. She has periods of lucidity, but they can become rarer and rarer over time. Often she's got outbursts of uncontrollable anger and destroys crockery and crystal vases, set her hounds on a maid, tore up pictures and books. And then sometimes she just sits there and knits, so she has a tough life too. During World War I, she's still an Archduchess of Austria, and so that's protected her from the German occupiers of Belgium, and her life went on unchanged. In fact, German General Moritz von Bissing had a sign affixed to the gates of the castle which read, "This domain, property of the Crown of Belgium, is occupied by Her Majesty the Empress of Mexico, Archduchess of Austria, sister-in-law of Emperor Franz Joseph, our illustrious ally." She finally dies of pneumonia in 1927. Lived a long time. I mentioned Cameroon in the French Foreign Legion. This is a big deal for them. Bazaine recovered Captain Danjou's wooden hand after the battle. Every year, the members of French Foreign Legion commemorate Cameroon Day, wherever they are, April 30th. They have some kind of a ceremony. In Aubonne, France, which is the headquarters of the Foreign Legion, they have a big parade. And the greatest honor in the whole Foreign Legion is to be the guy that gets to carry Captain Danjou's hand. And there it is. And that's it.